Hello student, welcome to lecture 2.3, Life on the Cotton Plantation. In this lecture, we will cover many different things concerning the lives of the slaves on the cotton plantation, which was by that time known as King Cotton. So we will start with the invention of cotton gin by Eli Whitney, which led to the increase of cotton production as well as the increase of the number of slaves in the South. We will talk about the slave ownership, how many slaves did the white people own, and did all white people own each one of them one slave. We will talk about that too. And we will talk about other cash crops that were grown by the slaves. And moreover, we will talk about the different types of slaves, different categories of slaves, starting with the slaves who were working on the field, on the plantation, who are known as field hands. We will talk also about those who work in the house, known as house slaves, the slaves in the cities, skilled urban slaves, and then the punishment of slaves, the families of slaves, the sexual exploitation of slaves, and finally we will talk about diet, clothing, health, and religions of slaves. First, let's talk about cotton. Cotton became the dominant cash crop in the United States in the early 1800s, and it was called King Cotton. And this was due to the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney. So Eli Whitney was an American inventor. He invented different things, but his most important invention was the cotton gin in 1793. The cotton gin allowed the separation of cotton seeds from the cotton fiber, and we need the fiber to make the cloth. So the cotton gin speed up the process of producing cotton fiber, and it made also cotton plantation the most profitable plantation in the United States and even around the world. This led also to the increase of the size of plantation, especially in the South, as well as the increase of the number of slaves in the South and the Midwest. We can see on this figure the picture of the cotton gin, which was invented by Eli Whitney, and this one was displayed at his museum, the Eli Whitney Museum in Connecticut. It looks small, it's a small device, but it did great things. It greatly influenced the cotton production. So now let's talk about the effect of cotton gin on the number of slaves and the production of cotton. Concerning the number of slaves first, the total number of slaves in this country increased from approximately 700,000 in 1790, so that was 3 years before the invention of the cotton gin, to 1.2 million in 1810. So less than 10 years after the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. And you will see that the number of slaves will amount to almost 4 million just before the Civil War in 1860. With regard to the cotton production. The cotton production also increased from almost nothing, from zero in 1790 to 178,000 bales in 1810. The production of cotton is measured in bales, so that's a pack of cotton, a huge one, and by 1850 the total number of bales produced in the United States amounts to 2 million. This chart shows us the increase of the number of slaves and the cotton produced in the United States. As you can see, the number of slaves went from 700,000 in 1790 to almost 4 million in 1860, just before the Civil War. And we already talked about that earlier. In 1810, there were already 1.2 million slaves in the U.S. This table also shows us the number of slaves in 1820 and 1860, as well as the number of slaves per states. So in 1820, there were 1.5 million slaves all over the United States. In 1860, the number of slaves increased to 3.9 million, so almost 4 million. And the states with the most slaves before Civil War were Virginia, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and South Carolina. Each one of these states had more than 400,000 slaves just before the Civil War. Now, how about the slave ownership? Did every family, white family in the United States, own at least one slave? The response is no. Not every white family in the U.S., especially in the South, own a slave. In some states, like the state of South Carolina, almost 50% of all white families did not own any slave at all. In some states, like the state of Arkansas, only 20% of the white family own some slaves, which means that the great majority, 80%, did not own any slave at all. In addition to that, half of those who own slaves only own 5 slaves or less. And the number of slave owners actually declined between 1790 and 1860. This means that there were just a few number of white families who owned most of the slaves in the South, who owned these 4 million slaves. Some of these families actually own more than 1,000. And I have an example here. According to public records, Joshua Ward, who lived in Georgetown, South Carolina, had 1,103 slaves, which were distributed among his 6 rice plantations. So this is the man who has the most slaves in the United States, before Civil War. Finally, it is well known that some African Americans and even some Native Americans own some slaves. And if you Google that, you will find out that up to 20,000 or more African Americans family actually own some slaves. So what were the other cash crops grown by the slaves? In addition to cotton, tobacco was still produced in the Upper South, which means in North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. Those states still produce a lot of tobacco, and even today. In the Lower South, especially in South Carolina and Georgia, rice was king. So rice production was dominant in South Carolina and Georgia, even when cotton production was introduced. And in other states, and especially in the Midwest, in addition to cotton, slaves in those states were growing sugar cane. That's the case of Louisiana. Hemp, that's the case of Missouri and Kentucky. So these are the cash crops produced by the slaves before the Civil War. Now let's talk about the different groups of slaves or different categories of slaves. 70% of the slaves were working on the plantation, and they were called field hands. Plantation slaves did everything on the plantation, from the preparation of the land by tilling the land for cultivation to harvesting and packing the crops for sale. So they did everything with regard to the production of a cash crop. In addition to that, sometimes they were even required to provide for their own food, so they have to grow their own food and cook them in addition to work, and even they were required to make their own clothing and build their own house. So they really did everything on the plantation. The other category of slaves were the house slaves. So these are the slaves who lived in the house of a master. The house slaves make up about 15% of the slaves, of the total number of slaves, and they were under the supervision, direct supervision of the white masters. And they were cut off from the slaves on the plantation. So these house slaves work as a cook, so they're cooking for the masters, or maid, or butlers, or even nurse and a gardener. There are also some skilled slaves on the plantation, but working close to the masters. They are working as carpenter, blacksmiths, and even millwrights. And these skilled slaves build and maintain plantation houses and sometimes the slave quarters and the machineries. In the city there are another group of slaves, so those are the urban and industrial slaves. These urban slaves could earn money, and they have less control, and because they earn money they are able to purchase their freedom over the years. The industrial slavery overlapped with the urban slavery, but specifically with regard to the industrial slaves, they were not purchased, but they were hired from masters to do some work. Concerning the punishment of the slaves, and there are a lot of stories about this, white Southerners on the plantation especially believed that slaves would not work unless they were beaten, or at least threatened to be beaten. So the fear of whipping drove slaves to mutual protection. So they have to protect themselves, and they even have to teach their children how to avoid whipping, how to avoid punishment, and resist the overseers. The main punishment of slaves during this time, especially in the United States, was whipping. But sometimes slaves could be in prison. They could be put in seclusion in some dark room, and they can be also hanged. So these are the main punishments in the United States, but in other slave countries, the punishment may be a little bit different from what happened in the United States. So this is a famous photograph of a slave called Peter with scars of several years of whipping. Peter was photographed by abolitionists, which means people who fought against slavery during the Civil War, and this picture is really a famous picture of how the slaves were treated by their master in the United States. Now let's turn to the lives of the slaves, starting with their family. There were marriages between male and female slaves, but these marriages were not recognized by the masters, and the government authority did not always did not keep the records of this marriage and the children from this marriage. However, the masters benefit from this marriage because the number of slaves grew with the children. So at least they kept the names of the slaves from the marriage, but not the marriage themselves. So most enslaved men and women could choose their mate. So there was no story about forced marriage. With regard to the family itself, the family was always the core of the African American life on the plantation. So it was also the core of the whole community. With regard to the sexual relations between masters and slaves, long-term relationship between white male masters and black female slaves were common on most plantations. The most famous case was that between Thomas Jefferson and his slave Sally Hemings, with whom he had many children, but he did not recognize any of these children. Rapes of female slaves by their white masters also were common on the plantations. Concerning their diets and clothing, the slaves really lacked nutrients in their diet. The diet consists only of corn and sometimes with a little bit of meat, with bacon, supplemented by some vegetable grown by the slaves and also by some eggs and poultry. And the African Americans, free or black slaves, perfected, the cooking tradition from Africa. So they continue the cuisine, the way of cooking food from Africa. Concerning the clothing, slaves usually receive clothes from the masters, generally about twice a year. But sometimes some slaves have to make their own clothing by spinning cotton, especially in the South. And the children also in the South went naked during the warmth season. So that's about the diet and clothing. With regard to their health in general, southern climates encourage mosquito-borne disease like the malaria. So the slaves had to use the medicine that they learned from their ancestors, and most likely from Africa, because they didn't have a medical doctor to take care of them. But the slaves' population grew by natural reproduction, which means that generally speaking, they were somehow wealthy to be able to reproduce. Finally, let's talk about the religion. Some slaves attended church service, Christian church services sponsored by their masters. Sometimes they even sit in the same church as the masters. But many slaves were denied even the access to Christianity, so they did not attend church service. They were not provided with a preacher, and in many places also there are some slaves who really ignore religion. So they just practice whatever belief they had before. But there were also in some places there were a secret church, black semi-secret church, where slaves come, to attend church, and these are done mostly at night. So that was with regard to the religion and practice of Christianity among the slaves. So that concludes lecture 2.3. Please move to lecture 2.4 to continue the module.